Hi, and welcome to our training module on serving and working with Black clients who have been impacted by justice involvement. In this first video, we'll explore some foundational historical context, some defining language, and the ongoing systemic racism experienced by Black people in Canada. This information will be crucial as we explore the collateral consequences of justice involvement and how systemic racism and discrimination have perpetuated historical inequities which impact the experiences of Black people in the justice system. Let's get started with some history. The first known Black African to arrive in Canada was Mathieu da Costa. Although aspects of his life remain unclear, historical records describe da Costa as a free man who served as an interpreter for the French and Dutch, as he was fluent in French, Dutch, and Portuguese. Some records claim that he acted as an interpreter for Indigenous people on Turtle Island, but this claim has been disputed, with some saying that it was more likely that da Costa spoke a fusion between Basque and the local Indigenous languages, a fusion that was commonly used during trading along the Atlantic coast of North America. Other records indicate that he was in Holland in early 1607 and arrived in Canada in 1608, leaving it likely that he was kidnapped by the Dutch from the French and then brought to Canada, explaining his fluency in the French and Dutch languages. Piecing together the fragmented history of da Costa has proved challenging, but we do know his story and presence in Canada at the beginning of the 17th century begins long before his birth. Like da Costa, the story of many Black Africans who were illegally transported to North America and throughout the Caribbean begins with the slave trade that started in the 15th century. What is known as the Scramble for Africa began with the Portuguese setting up trading posts along the west and central coasts of Africa. The Portuguese were the first to build slave ships and slave forts, such as Elmina Castle in 1482, used to fortify and control the slave trade. Next, they enslaved Black Africans, creating the makings of the Atlantic slave trade, which resulted in the illegal capture, sale, and disbursement of over 15.5 million Black Africans to North America, Europe, and the global South. In Canada, the early presence of Black people was in New France, or what is now known as Quebec. In New France, slavery was introduced when French settlers brought enslaved Africans to the region to be used in domestic and agricultural roles. After the conquest of New France by the British in 1763, the practice of slavery continued in what was then referred to as British North America. 12 years later, in 1775, the American Revolution ushered in the arrival of Black Loyalists, who were African Americans who fought for the British during the American Revolution and were promised freedom and land in return for their loyalty to the British Crown. The Black Loyalists represented the largest Black population in Canada, settling in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Ontario. They were faced with broken promises of their freedom and land and were subjected to harsh living conditions, racial discrimination, and segregation, which led to many Black Loyalists leaving Canada, with some emigrating to Sierra Leone. Amidst a declining population and insurmountable odds, the Black population that remained grew and worked to build strong and resilient communities and fostered a sense of identity and solidarity among Black Canadians. When slavery was abolished in Canada in 1834, Canada became a destination for fugitive slaves escaping the United States via the Underground Railroad. Many came to know the name of Harriet Tubman, a Black woman who helped many reach freedom in Canada. Yet, even with slavery abolished, African Canadians continued to face systemic racial discrimination and segregation, with some returning to the United States because life in Canada post-slavery still had a lack of civil rights for Black people. In the early 20th century, Black immigrants were subject to discriminatory immigration policies, limiting their entry into Canada, all while Black Canadians continued to contribute significantly to Canadian society, including many who served in both world wars. In the 1960s and 70s, changes to immigration policies led to increased Black immigration, which continues today, from places including from the United States, Caribbean, Europe, Africa, and the Americas, ultimately enriching Canada's cultural diversity. Notwithstanding the rollback on some of these more overtly discriminatory policies, Black Canadians continue to face systemic racism and discrimination in Canada in many ways. We're going to look at some of those ways shortly, but first, let's review some key concepts and define language crucial to understanding the experiences of Black people in Canada. Our choice of words we use to communicate shape how we view history and identity. So understanding the nuances and context behind certain terms is essential when discussing the barriers faced by Black individuals in Canada. One of the key terms to understand is that of anti-Black racism. Anti-Black racism is defined as prejudice, attitudes, beliefs, stereotyping, and discrimination that is directed against the Black population. It is deeply rooted and reinforced in Canadian institutions, policies, and practices. Anti-Black racism is manifested in the social, economic, and political marginalization of Black Canadians in society. Most notably, the lack of opportunities, lower socioeconomic status, higher unemployment and labor market inequity, significant poverty rates, medical racism, and disproportionate overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. Anti-Black racism in Canada is rooted in Canada's history of colonialism, slavery, segregation, and discriminatory policies, practices, and attitudes. The Canadian state and government's relationship with Black Canadians is one which is grounded in the legacy and trauma of the past, with systemic and institutional anti-Black racism continuing to impact the lives of Black Canadians in all aspects of daily living, including in their contact with the criminal justice system. Historic dehumanization and depictions of Black people as being animalistic, aggressive, violent, and dangerous have left systemic and pervasive biases, stereotypes, and oppression that continue to contribute to the disproportionate overrepresentation of Black people in the criminal justice system. Anti-Black racism can be overt and malicious or more subtle, like unconscious biases or laws that appear to treat everyone equally, but have differential impacts for Black Canadians. Some examples of how anti-Black racism presents in Canadian society today include Black youth being pushed out of schools more frequently through mechanisms like suspensions or expulsions, a lack of nutritious food and community programs in low-income racialized neighborhoods, racialized neighborhoods being underserved with less access to community-based services and transit, underrepresentation and social exclusion from decision-making within the community and at all levels of government, and greater risk of police contact and surveillance, detention, and incarceration. Anti-Black racism can also present in the form of subtle comments or actions that convey prejudiced attitudes or discriminatory behaviors toward members of marginalized groups. These can be intentional or unintentional, but reflect underlying biases and stereotypes. This can look like othering, name-calling, a subtle snub, or an insult. Some examples of what this might include for the Black community are a Black person being asked where they are really from, complimenting a Black person by saying they are surprisingly well-spoken, or suggesting that you are not racist towards Black individuals because you have Black friends. Colorism is something that can also go into this, as it is a form of prejudice or discrimination in which people are treated differently based on the shade of their skin tone. It is an outgrowth of colonialism and racism, and can also occur within the same racial or ethnic group, and often leads to lighter-skinned individuals receiving preferential treatment. We see examples of colorism, as well as featureism and texturism, when preferential treatment or comments are directed at people with more European aesthetic features, and when these features are seen as more appropriate or beautifully appealing. For example, media campaigns that feature light or lighter-skinned Black people with straighter hair is an example of colorism and texturism. Featureism, which is often an offshoot of colorism, is seen when a person's facial features or body contours are perceived as more appealing or beautiful if they are closer aligned to European aesthetics. For example, a straighter nose or smaller lips or smaller body proportions have historically been more socially acceptable. It's important to understand that colorism remains a remnant of colonial ideologies that historically positioned Blackness in social status and skin color as negative, deficient, and as a deficit. Because of this, many Black people in North America have experienced intergenerational trauma when it comes to seeing themselves in a positive manner. Finally, there are also differences between the terms African Canadian and Black Canadian. African Canadian can refer to someone who is of African descent and who was born or is living in Canada. Because of the disbursement of people during the Atlantic slave trade, this includes a diverse group of people with roots tracing back to the African continent. Black Canadian, while similar to African Canadian, is a broader term that can include anyone who identifies as Black, regardless of their specific country of origin. Black people from the Caribbean, South America, Europe, and any other part of the world living or born in Canada can be included in this category. Another broader term is that of African diaspora. The African diaspora refers to the communities throughout the world that are descended from the historic movement of peoples from Africa. For African Canadians, it connects them to a global community with shared histories and cultural experiences. While it is helpful to understand the differences in terms, it's important to keep in mind that racial categories and social identities aren't fixed. The term race is socially constructed, meaning that social meaning and not biology has been used to classify people into groups based on physical characteristics, cultural background, ancestry, or racial stereotypes. Because of this, classifying people into racial groups isn't something rigid, but instead can change with different geographical locations and cultural identifications or connections. When it comes to serving and working with Black clients, it is crucial to not only understand these defining concepts, but also understand the lenses and frames in which you can approach providing a more culturally safe space in your day-to-day work. There are 3 key lenses you can apply. The first is an anti-racism lens. Anti-racism refers to the efforts, policies, and practices aimed at fighting racism and promoting racial equity. It involves identifying, challenging, and changing the values, structures, and behaviors that perpetuate systemic racism. Anti-racism goes beyond merely being non-racist. It requires active participation in addressing and dismantling racism in all its forms, including through education, advocacy, accountability, solidarity, and self-reflection. The second is an anti-oppression lens. Anti-oppression is not only a way of thinking, but it is also a tool to understand and respond to the complexity of the experience of oppression. It is a way of not only naming the oppression that happens against African Canadians and others, based on their identity, but also a way to work towards ending that mistreatment toward that particular group. Anti-oppression affects everyone, including those who experience it, as well as those who experience privilege. And the last is an intersectional lens. Intersectionality is a framework for understanding how various forms of oppression, such as racism, sexism, ableism, and classism, intersect and impact individuals. For Black individuals living in Canada, this means recognizing how race intersects with other aspects of their identity, including income, sexual orientation, skin shade, age, religion, gender identity, neighborhood, immigration status, disability, and language, among others. When considering the scope and impacts of anti-Black racism, it is equally important to consider these intersectional factors. This will allow you to deepen your understanding of your client and support more informed actions and referrals. We'll cover these lenses in a little more detail in the next module and how you can action them in your work with your clients. But now that we've covered some of the historical context and defining concepts, let's take a look at the current context and barriers faced by Black individuals in Canada. In Canada, there are stark differences in the perceptions of racism and discrimination towards Black people. While research shows that over 80% of Black Canadians say they are treated unfairly at least sometimes, half of non-Black Canadians believe discrimination against Black people is no longer a problem. Even though Black Canadians have been statistically shown to have reduced likelihood of being hired for jobs, impaired career progression, less access to physical and mental health care, and lower educational opportunities and achievement, half of non-Black Canadians continue to believe that discrimination against Black people in Canada is no longer an issue. Persistent anti-Black racism present in the criminal justice system is also a stark reminder of the systemic racial discrimination that the Black population continues to experience in Canada. Black defendants are acutely aware of how racism impacts their contact with the criminal justice system at all of its stages. Whether it is interacting with the police, the courts, being incarcerated, or even having a criminal record and returning to society, systemic anti-Black racism pervades the experiences of Black Canadians who are involved in the criminal justice system. Black people are disproportionately stopped by police, questioned and searched, and experience more negative outcomes from their interactions with police, which compounds inequalities at later stages in the justice system, including not as frequently being diverted out of the justice system through diversion programs and higher rates of discretionary charges being added to their record. Yet, these are not new experiences. Black people have had a long and difficult relationship with police and policing in Canada, with efforts to surveil and control the movements and actions of Black bodies present since slavery and persisting today. Because of this historical and ongoing systemic anti-Black racism, many Black communities continue to have a distrust of public or government institutions, including the police, healthcare, education, and legal system. Black individuals often encounter discrimination, stereotyping, and racial profiling, which leads to negative experiences that foster distrust. Furthermore, lack of racial and cultural understanding and awareness of the historical and contemporary barriers faced leads to the specific needs and concerns of Black communities being under or unaddressed, a disconnect that can result in services that don't resonate with or meet the needs of these communities. In response to this, many Black communities have developed their own institutions, organizations, and networks to support their needs outside of mainstream public institutions. This historical colonial trauma and distrust continues to surround the experiences of Black people, and it's something that you must be mindful of as you are working with and serving Black clients. Ensuring that you are promoting a safe and respectful space for Black clients, as well as taking a trauma-informed approach which considers Black social history in Canada, is critical to effectively supporting Black justice-involved clients. In our next video, we'll cover how to incorporate the understanding of this history and the ongoing inequities when building relationships with and serving Black clients, as well as a deeper dive on how anti-Black racism manifests in the Canadian criminal justice system.